things like having their passports confiscated. They don't pocket all the money. There are restrictions on their families being able to accompany them, so that if there's a defection, the state still has that that twist on you.
What is the relationship between South Africa and Cuba, and are South Africans benefiting from this relationship? This is a question explored by Terence Corrigan of the Institute of Race Relations in 2 new articles which unpack the strategic relationship between South Africa and the communist nation of Cuba. Terence, welcome back to the CRA channel. Could you tell our viewers what are the key themes that you explore in these 2 pieces? And what is the specific context of the historical relationship between these 2 countries?
The 2 you're referring to were published a couple of weeks back, and I was looking specifically at the question of medical cooperation between South Africa and Cuba. The broader relations have fascinated me since the 1990s. If you remember, Nelson Mandela, prior to becoming president, wrote a very celebrated article in which he said human rights would be the guiding light of South Africa's foreign policy. And I always thought this was going to sit very uncomfortably with some of the countries that had supported the ANC, and which had internally very suspect democratic credentials and poor records on human rights. Cuba is obviously one of them, but Cuba has a place in South Africa's, or certainly in the ANC's imagination, that no other country does. A lot of this is historical, and a lot of it is ideological. Cuba, there's a sense of political machismo about it. Cuba was the country that is that in certain narratives is credited with having defeated the SADF in Angola, the Battle of Quito Carnival. Now, historians actually debate what happened there and what the outcome signified. But for the ANC, which waged a 3-decade-long armed struggle that was almost entirely ineffective, there was a kind of refracted glory in that. It's interesting to note that the ANC was not present at the Battle of Quito Carnival. There have been some attempts to weave in a sort of phantom presence, but essentially they were in a different part of Angola. Cubans were there, SWAPO was there, the Angolans were there, the ANC was not. But yes, it was it was one of the largest pitched battles since World War II fought in Africa, and it certainly inflicted losses on the SADF, and it was claimed as a victory. Cuba, was also the sort of Havana as the socialist nirvana. Especially as Moscow faded out of the picture in the 1990s, there was a lot that was very emblematic of what the ANC stood for. It was a country of the global South. It was a poor developing country that nonetheless had made enormous developmental strides. In terms of education, healthcare, human development, there certainly is some quite noteworthy progress that it can point to. It also, since the 1970s, had been extending its support in this respect, both bilaterally and multilaterally. And as the Cold War wound down and the demand for Cuban troops, whether in Angola, whether in Ethiopia or Syria, or backing insurgencies in Central America dried up and became less, shall we say, less politically correct. The idea that it could still export its human capital, its healthcare, that remained a big thing. First of all, Cuba doesn't do this altruistically. It makes money out of it. Recipient countries pay for it. Now, sometimes this might go through an international body, and Cuba, because it's a tightly controlled economy, the Cuban government can at times underbid other countries that might want to sell their services. But fundamentally, this works with the principles of labor broking. Cuba supplies the healthcare workers. They do the work. The government, the host government, will then pay most of the money over to the Cuban state. In South Africa's case, from what I understand, particularly about the doctors, Cuban doctors were getting a more or less fair wage, but I imagine there was a big surcharge on that going to the Cuban government. In places like Venezuela, it's very different. There's a very dark side to it. Not only are these doctors put under enormous pressure by the Cuban authorities, things like having their passports confiscated. They don't pocket all the money. There are restrictions on their families being able to accompany them, so that if there's a defection, the state still has that twist on you. And there have also been very credible reports that they've been instructed to use healthcare provision as a weapon. In other words, if you are known to be a supporter of the opposition, the clinic doesn't treat you, or it puts you at the bottom of the list or whatever. Or it just doesn't have the equipment to treat you, whereas a supporter of the regime would get that. Once again, there's no evidence that this has happened in South Africa.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
Terence, that raises the question of what is it that Cuba is selling that South Africa is willing to pay for, and are we getting good value for our money?
One could make an argument about perhaps about the medical skills, although the direct import of Cuban doctors has slowed down considerably since the 1990s. There were both good and bad experiences with that. But now most of South Africa's medical cooperation with Cuba takes the form of South African students going to study in Cuba. There've been issues that have gone back and forth about that. There've been concerns about poor living conditions, about the difficulties of studying in a foreign language. I understand there've also been concerns about the stipends being given, and how that gives South African students their access to a standard of living that many Cuban medical professionals can't reach. There was also an interesting thing I read some time ago about South African students being too overtly religious, which is frowned upon in a state that was aggressively, in its own words, atheist for a long time, and then decided to be more PC and called itself secular. But the point is they're not wild about bourgeois religion. When it comes to servicing vehicles or servicing water, I don't know. I think that the most logical inference is that this is essentially a form of aid. South Africa has very few complementarities with Cuba. I think that in 2018 we exported about $1.6 million worth of goods to Cuba and imported about 4.2 million back, which is very, very small. In fact, our trade relationships with countries like Curacao and Belize are larger. I challenge you to find 20 arbitrary South Africans you can locate Belize on a map. And maybe 20 you can tell you that Curacao is actually a country. The point is we just don't. There's not much that the Cubans can buy from us or can afford to buy from us, or that they need from us, and there's very little we need from them. In fact, 92% of what we import from Cuba is hard liquor and rolled tobacco. Dr. Dlamini Zuma has an absolute fixation with Cuba, but apparently not from the stuff that comes out of Cuba. So while we were importing this COVID brigade into South Africa, we declared most of their imports contraband. There's ironies there, but I think essentially what you have is a situation where a government here has an inflated sense of its ideological commitments and responsibilities, and wants to essentially hand over resources to the Cubans. Now, even amongst the most Cuban-friendly of its support base, going and saying, well, we're going to give 64 million rand to the Cubans, and you'll have to wait for your new school or your new clinic, probably isn't going to go down very well. So we need a justification to spend that money. Justification is that we import skills that are of doubtful value to us. Water, for instance, Cuba's water system is extremely rickety. Water outages are very common. There has been some progress as a result of various UN-sponsored initiatives, But fundamentally, Cuba is working with a very, very antiquated infrastructure in a particular tropical climate. The way that it sources water, reflects its geography, and this is simply not the reality in South Africa. In South Africa, it's about transferring water resources from one basin to another, which is not the case in Cuba. Yes, some of our infrastructure is antiquated, but it's doubtful that that 24 Cuban engineers have much of are going to enable us to get much of a handle on it. Plus, there are big issues with registration. Don't forget that engineers are held professionally liable, and they have to be registered. You have to write tests, and it goes through an international standard setting system to which Cuba is not a party. Now, Anthony Turton has made a remark on this, that what he suspects is that there would be absolutely no recourse if there was a problem, and essentially this would be operating under some sort of a diplomatic immunity. This is not great when you're dealing with infrastructure.
Thanks very much, Terence. It seems to me that the relationship is more about ideological posturing than any strategic benefit. My name is David Ansara. This is the Center for Risk Analysis. Please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. What do you think is driving this very strong relationship between communist Cuba and South Africa, and are we benefiting as a country? Until next time, take care.